Let me just now begin to introduce to you our first speaker, Professor Andrew Beer. Andrew is the Dean of Research and Innovation at the University of South Australia Business School. He's the chair of the London-based Regional Studies Association and a fellow of the Regional Australia Institute. He has a long history of research in the monitoring, in the operation and functioning of Australian housing markets and the impacts of an ageing population on such markets. I mentioned recently, just a moment ago, that this is a very timely topic, and I think for many of you we just need to reflect on some of the information that we've received from the analysis of the census, the Australian census, and the changing demographic of the population. We only have to cast our minds to things like the Oakton mental health facility and the indication of abuse of patients there, and even comments as recently as the Four Corners report on ABC Radio about retirement communities and concerns about difficulties associated with residents there. So this is a very timely topic. And just before I ask Professor Andrew Beer to come to the platform here, I would just like to mention that he is currently the chair of the South Australian Government's Homelessness Strategic Group. So we're very lucky to have Andrew speak with us today, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming him to the stage. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
I'll go over time and give you a 5-minute warning.
Yes, I think Fern will do that.
Agreeing to going. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Ruth, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. This topic, for me, is something of a personal journey. It's a personal journey because it reflects a transition in my thinking that's taken some time to arrive, the better part of 10 years, and which at a personal level was brought home to me with the recent discussion of events in Oakton, but also an awareness that my own mother, who's 84, increasingly worries about quality of care issues, increasingly worries about where and how she'll live, increasingly worries about how she'll get access to support and services. Now, this has been a 10-year journey for me because I have not always worked on issues associated with the aged care sector. My PhD was on the housing industry in Canberra, and I worked on that broad field for many years. But over some time, I gradually drifted across a range of topics and eventually came to a point where I was invited by one of South Australia's largest providers of independent living units, ECH, to do some work for them about the nature of demand for their products, for their housing. And the thing that struck me was that it was a very interesting topic to undertake research on, but also that as I looked at that sector, I saw a huge range of outcomes. And in fact, I know that one of my former colleagues from those days is in this audience today. So some organisations uniformly produced good outcomes and behaved in what we could think of as an ethical way, and other organisations were much less trustworthy or reliable, we could say, in terms of their behaviours, their actions, and their strategies for intervening in the aged care sector. And as I've worked in the field over a decade, I've also come to realise that it's a very complex sector, and I'll touch upon that as I give my presentation. So, that's not working. I'm fine now. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about 4 key sorts of topics. Firstly, I want to talk about risk. And I want to talk about risk as a way of providing a framework in which we can understand the environment in which ageing now takes place in Australia. I then want to talk about the aged care sector and perhaps develop a common understanding or a shared understanding of where this sector sits and why it's so important for the nation as well as for us as individuals as we all age. And then I want to give some thoughts around ethical behaviour and those behaviours which may or may not be considered to be ethical and what that really represents in terms of the moral challenge we face. And then I want to draw out some conclusions. And I'll share with you now that I don't know what an ethical aged care sector looks like. All I know is it's important to map out that there is a need for an ethical aged care sector. And perhaps my colleague Wendy Lacey will give some greater insights into what that may be in her presentation that follows mine. So the first thing I want to talk about is risk. And this idea of risk is partly drawn on the work of a German but British-based sociologist called Ulrich Beck. And he argued that in the modern era we live in a world full of risk, that it's risk that we as individuals and as a society have created. And it's risk that's associated with the way we structure our economy and society. So if we think about change over our society over time, what we see is that things have changed in ways that have created new risks that we haven't necessarily adapted to. So if we look at this first image, what we see is Australia in the 1970s, an industrial society, a society with near universal male employment, with high standards of living, but a relatively short life expectancy. So if we think about people's life course in that period, it was in many ways predictable, uniform, and with relatively few unexpected risks. So traditionally people would leave school, move very quickly into the world of paid work, form a relationship, marry young. My mother was 21 when she was married. Have children, enter home ownership, stay in paying off a mortgage for most of their working lives before finally achieving outright home ownership. And having a few golden years or even a few golden decades where the children had left home and income was greater than expenditure before moving to a point where they're retired. They might move into a retirement village or an aged care home late in life, or they might not, with average life expectancy terminating somewhere between 72 and 76. A predictable, established, secure life course. But if we think about Australia in 2017, it is much more turmoil riddled. For one, we live much longer now. When my youngest daughter was born in the year 2000, her life expectancy at birth as a South Australian girl was 79. She's now 17, so her life expectancy is now probably closer to 85 or 86. A woman in South Australia who achieves the age of 60 is more likely than not to reach 90. And if there's one piece of good news for all of us in the room, it's that as you get older, your life expectancy increases. So that's great news for all of us. But to go on, we now have much more complex life courses, and it's shown in this diagram. There's not just the risk of living longer and potentially outliving your lifetime savings. There's also risks associated with the increased incidence of divorce, the increased incidence of people having to provide care both to their older relatives and also to their children, often at the same time, the greater risk of being made redundant and losing paid employment, the increased risk of losing your partner in other ways and repartnering, all of which adds complexity to your life and potential greater risk, potentially greater wealth, but also many potential incidents where you lose assets and living standards. worth reflecting on the fact that 42% of all marriages in Australia still end in divorce. So it's a very high risk there. And divorce, as some of us must know, doesn't necessarily help your wealth at all. But one of the key points for me, and the focus of this presentation, is in fact the end of the life stage, because what we now see is the end of the life stage has changed much more than any other part of the life course. It's even more different compared to the 1970s than the start of the life course, because people are living longer, and those transitions at the end of life, or in more advanced age, are now much more complex. There are more complex needs for care, there are more complex forms of health intervention, and there are more complex requirements, many of which actually come with very considerable benefits for the individual in terms of quality of life, opportunities for travel, opportunities to network, opportunities to be socially connected, but also carry with them risk. And that is an issue of concern. That's the broad framework of risk I want to examine this issue within. But I think it's important to reflect on the fact that there still remains a broad concern over the ethical envelope of aged care services and support. Since the 1980s in particular, what we have seen is we have seen many social supports for all individuals at all stages of the life course privatised and commercialised. And this has in fact challenged our understanding of what good practice is and what good sense means, particularly as business imperatives now intrude upon the delivery of services and our sense of society at all stages of the life course, including the more vulnerable stages of the life course. We need to acknowledge that by far the majority of services and supports offered to older people in Australia are both of high quality and ethical. And when I present some data later in this presentation, you'll see that the challenges we face are actually quite small relative to the total size of the industry. But there's been concern over retirement villages and their practice, with the recent ABC Four Corners story focusing on AVIO, but those practices are by no means limited to one company. They can be found in every part of Australia and in many, many businesses, some for profits and some not for profits. There's been considerable focus on Oakden and care for older people with advanced psychiatric disability. But there are many other comparable events elsewhere in South Australia, and you only need to look at the coroner's reports to realise that there are a number of incidents where care has been lacking in this jurisdiction, but also elsewhere in Australia. And I'm sure Wendy might well touch upon in her presentation issues of elder abuse by family members, and that can include incidents of violence, but also financial abuse, emotional abuse, etc. So fundamentally, the provision of care has been commercialised, financialised and privatised, and I think it's important that we as a society ask, to what end? And can we then also ask, can we then develop a framework that delivers much more ethical outcomes all the time, every time, for everyone? I just want to present relatively briefly some data on the aged care industry so we have a shared understanding, as I mentioned before, about what this sector looks like and how large it is. So the Australian Government expenditure on aged care throughout 2015-2016 was $16.2 billion, and that increased by 6.6% from the previous year. That's in a period in which inflation was running at just under 2%. Of that $16 billion or so, about $11.4 billion was spent on residential aged care, the highest and most intensive form of aged care provided. Expenditure on residential care is currently growing at 5.1% per annum, and this is clearly outstripping inflation and potentially outstripping the capacity of governments to fund this service. And this is one of the reasons why, beginning probably back in 1990 with the introduction of compulsory superannuation, Australian governments have begun to look at new ways of supporting older people in their later years. There's been growth in the sector with 17,385 new aged care places allocated in 2015, but that allocation is not keeping pace with the rate of demand for residential aged care places, and we know that effectively the population aged over 65 in this country will double between now and 2030. The cost per individual is high, $63,400 for each individual assisted. The sector is enormously large. There are over 350,000 workers in the aged care sector alone in this country. And ironically, there's always a staff shortage. There's always a need for additional workers for a whole range of reasons. Those 350,000 workers service 283 operational aged care places, of which 200,000 were residential care, 80,000 roughly were home care places, and several restorative care places. These 350,000 workers were working for just under 1,000 residential aged care providers and associated industries, and this does not include retirement villages and what they may do. What is clear in this slide, and I won't try and read it out for you, I'll leave it for you to consider, is that it's a large sector with a large population with complex challenges ahead of it. One of the things we need to recognise is that the average age for men entering residential aged care is 82, and for women it's 84.5. And about 50% of this group had a diagnosis of dementia. But what does this really mean? What this really means is that when we talk about residential aged care, we're really talking about an endpoint. And what we don't then say, and what we don't then acknowledge, is that in fact there are many stages before that, all of which raise ethical challenges in and of themselves. Because prior to moving into residential aged care, if we move backwards, it's quite likely people will be getting home support. And that's a really important step. I'll be touching upon that later. And prior to that, they may well be living in a retirement village or their own home. And prior to that, they may well be engaging in many, many activities before that. And these aren't steps changes that people have to follow in any particular order, but we need to recognise and acknowledge this complexity in this dynamic. But there are challenges, and this is one of the things I want to focus upon. I want to challenge upon the fact that while I said earlier on, most of the support and services provided in the aged care sector in Australia is of very high quality and very ethical, there are far too many incidences of events that we do not find acceptable as a society. So if we just look at one piece of data, to begin with, assault. 2,422 reports of unreasonable force, 396 of alleged or suspected unlawful sexual contact, and 44 of both. The rate of incidence was low, which is good news, at 1.2%. But how do we view that figure? How do we view that number in an environment where we should think any incidence of force or assault in an aged care setting is unacceptable? One of the things that this federal government does is that they actually actively audit aged care providers and try and ensure particular standards. Many of us remember the incident of kerosene baths back in the 1990s. Horrendous behaviours, horrendous practices. And what we see is that the Australian government uses the Aged Care Accreditation Authority to check on, monitor, evaluate agencies, and if events happen that they find, or arrangements are in place they find unacceptable, they then progress it to the next stage where the federal government itself imposes sanctions. And what we see is that the number of sanctions issued is relatively low. but there are significant numbers still of organisations and providers being found to be not delivering at a standard that we would expect. And this is unexpected to me, given that we live in an environment now where the processes of continuous improvement and quality assurance are well understood. All organisations should know where their benchmarks sit, and they should know how they can achieve against them. But somehow a number continue to fail to meet those expectations. Another example of questionable ethical behaviour relates to retirement villages, and Four Corners expose or story on AVIO was a really good example of the challenges the retirement industry faces, particularly in terms of villages. Retirement villages are actually a very small part of the accommodation of older Australians. Approximately 6% of older Australians live in retirement villages, and some work I did for ECH many, many years ago suggested they were actually a particular type of people. I called it at the time the California effect, the Hotel California effect, to be honest, because these are the people who reached retirement age and they wanted to check out from society, and the only young people they wanted to see after that point in time were their grandchildren. They wanted to be separate, they wanted to live in their own villages in their own times. But retirement villages are not uniform. Each and every one is unique, even within an established large-scale providers such as AVIO or many of the other large companies, both public and private sector. Each development is organised, arranged and contracted under different terms. So I think in 2008 there were 30,000 different types of contract for retirement villages and independent living units in Australia. 30,000. So if you're talking about the retirement village unit you're living in with someone who lives in another part of Adelaide, the chances are their arrangements are not your arrangements. And I think in part it's because consumers make mistakes. Consumers make mistakes in the fact that they retire, they look to move to accommodation or to living arrangements which better suit their circumstances. And they don't realise that what for them is a golden period is for someone else an opportunity to cash in. And that in fact, when they think they're moving into a house permanently, what they're taking out is not freehold tenure, but is in fact a licence to occupy often. And that licence to occupy often comes with very considerable caveats on what they can and cannot do, how much they have to pay, and what control they have over their accommodation. In large measures, consumers, I suspect, are unaware of the business of retirement. And while retirement villages can be a good option for some parts of the post-working life, they're not necessarily a good option for all parts of the post-working life or for all people. But it's very, very hard for people to know that. It's very hard for people to make those decisions. And once you enter into those arrangements, it can be very difficult to exit because you've perhaps committed all your capital to moving into that retirement village, and you can't exit without losing a lot of your wealth. The difficult decision which people often struggle with. We know that. Why don't we fix it? Why don't the organisations that provide these services fix it? Why don't they behave ethically, advertise they're behaving ethically and to a great moral standard, and then provide solutions that people can understand? On the 1st of July 2015, the Australian Government introduced a new form of care called Consumer-Directed Aged Care, which empowered older Australians to make decisions about their care. Where previously we had a model where the federal government gave some providers money to provide services to support older people in their homes, they swapped to a system which said, no, consumer sovereignty reigns here, let individuals choose what they're going to spend their money on. We're going to give them a certain amount of money, and that amount of money can be used to buy the services they want. So you can use your money under CDC to get a worker to drive you to the racecourse if that's what you want. Can't use that money to bet on the horses, but you can use the money to get to the racecourse if you want. But when you think about it, that also raises some complexities. It means that there's the older person having to make difficult decisions, and many people in receipt of consumer-directed aged care have significant disabilities and health challenges, and that's why they get this support from their government, and they're now forced to actively take control of this budget. And the research I've been doing with some colleagues, both at this university and the University of Adelaide, finds that CDC can work well. If you have a good advisor and if you have a good provider of services, people are very, very happy with this new model. But other people have less pleasant experiences. Other people find that, in fact, they've signed up to contracts that lock them in and that mean that if they exit the contract, they then have to pay an enormous amount of money in administration fees and potentially lose the best part of a year in terms of finance for support for their lifestyle. Is this the way we should be behaving as a society? Are these the behaviours that Australian government policy should be both allowing and supporting through our funding regimes? Is it ethical? Is it right? I think not. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I think this remains a great challenge for people like myself, people like Wendy, and everyone in this room, plus Australian society and Australian governments. We know we can do better, but I think at the moment we don't know how to do better. We have the aspiration without necessarily having a clear pathway forward. This is not a wicked problem, but this is a messy problem. And it's a messy problem because we've allowed it to become overly complex. As I think I showed you early on in this presentation, the aged care sector is large, but it's also complex. And it reflects many of the worst features of Australian federalism. To give you one example, if you are to receive a consumer-directed care assistance package, you have to go through a process where you have an ACAT assessment, Aged Care Assessment Team. Gives us the acronym ACAT. You go through an ACAT assessment. But the ACAT assessment is federally funded but delivered by state government organisations. And there are variations between the jurisdictions, between Victoria and Western Australia in particular, and the rest of Australia in how that set of assessments takes place and how it's delivered and organised. Why does it have to be so complex? Why does it have to be something where the Council of Australian Governments has to become involved? And of course, it's not just the government sector involved, it's also the private sector, the not-for-profit sector. We've made this an overly complex area for a variety of reasons I don't think we've ever thought through. I'd like to restate again that most providers work well and work ethically. But I would argue the data I've presented today suggests there are too many events. There are too many incidents. There are too many controversies. There are too many challenges. And that calls for reform, fundamental reform, in how the organisations that deliver services go about their business. We may not need reform of government policy, because governments have reformed their policies, but we may need a new mindset in the organisations that deliver those policies. We need to acknowledge that both the ageing of the population and further demand-led models will introduce greater risk for older Australians. This is not a problem that's going away. The band-aids being applied to the aged care sector today will not provide us solutions in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. We need more fundamental, more far-reaching change. Just to finish, what does an ethical aged care sector look like for Australia? Well, I don't know, but I hope we can get there. Other research done for governments and done for other organisations suggests that we can actually map out what an ethical aged care sector looks like by asking older people what they want. And they want care that gives them dignity, that gives them the respect, that gives them clear set of processes that allows them to have social connectedness and gives them high levels of physical care. So my question is, how do we get there? Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That was very, very stimulating, very timely, very informative. We have time for questions, a few questions before we have afternoon tea. We have a roving mic. Fern is managing that with great skill. And any questions? We have one.
Good afternoon. I think one of the problems with the age moving to villages is the problem of stamp duty, and that varies from state to state now, and also the problem of, in the future, and I think it may become a necessity to prevent a burden on society, that carers of aged care people be paid who are members of the family, which is not so at the moment.
Sorry, could I hear the last point again?
Carers of aged people being cared for by members of the family, they are not paid a allowance, and have to usually juggle their family and their job to provide a service that should have been taken up by the government in the first place.
Thank you for that. I think they're very good points. Clearly, the issue of stamp duty does challenge many parts of the life course in older age, because it is one of the things that both limits the capacity to move and also provides a psychological barrier. Stamp duty is a regressive tax, and it's unfortunately the most vulnerable older people who feel the greatest impact of that change. In terms of carers, I think one of the interesting things that we're increasingly seeing with the move to new models of care provision is there is the potential, and you see this in the NDIS as well, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, there is the potential to actually pay family members to provide you with care. That is a potential that you have. Now, whether it's sufficient to actually deliver the outcomes that people are looking for, I just don't know. But we do know that the Australian government to date hasn't put a lot of resources into supporting carers and the roles they play. It's the volunteer sector, as you point out, who really does much of the caring in Australian society.
Yes. And then there'll be another one just behind you later.
Thank you for such a very enlightening presentation. My point is about the issue of abuse and assault on older people in residential care. If 16 billion plus money goes for the support of these facilities, where is the strong role of government in strict and forceful monitoring and enforcement of accountability on these facilities? We noticed that in the media information about the issue about Auckland recently, we have not seen a very strong enforcement of monitoring of the practices of such facilities. Can you comment on that, please?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a good question. Look, at the very start of my working career, I actually worked in Canberra as a public servant. I was there for 4 rather unhappy years before I moved on. Not to say that people can't have a good working lives in Canberra, because many people do, just not me. The point I would make is that Canberra is a long way away. And I think while there's a regulatory framework in place at the moment that attempts to provide assurance that there are always good outcomes in aged care services, anything that depends on the central government to guarantee standards is likely to fail in a nation as large as Australia. You can't have a public servant posted to every aged care facility, every retirement village, monitoring standards, etc. I think the solution actually lies in the industry itself and the organisations within it taking up the challenge of establishing standards and assurance processes that will guarantee good outcomes for each and every older Australian. That's my sense. Government regulation should be the point of last resort. I think industry buy-in to high-quality standards should in fact be the first line of defence. When you think there are 350,000 people working in the aged care sector and we had over 1,000 providers, but in 2013, 15, 16, only 6 actually face sanctions nationally, that's actually a pretty good rate. Large organisations don't always deliver good outcomes, but they should always be aspiring to deliver outcomes. And I think the step towards getting to better outcomes, to getting to a zero incidence of abuse, is in fact for organisations, businesses, enterprises buying into an ethical framework.
Thanks very much. I do think perhaps Wendy will have more to say about that in her presentation after afternoon tea. Thanks, Fern.
Hello. Having experienced my mother having a home care program as well as going into a nursing home, I can tell you the home care program wasn't all that it should have been because, although it started off quite well, it ended up with money being cut to the providers, and then they started bringing in agency staff instead of regulars, and the people didn't do their job properly because there wasn't anyone to check on what they were doing. And then when she went to nursing home, what I've found is that there's a lot of overseas people doing the work, and I don't know whether they should be paid a bit more to get a better quality of person or a better trained person in there. The ones that I've seen have been very nice, but when people are getting a bit deaf and you've got someone with a heavy accent, it doesn't lead for a good outcome sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I'd agree. Care provided in the home can be a bit hit and miss, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, the huge advantage is people get to stay in their own homes, and that's what they want to do, and so it can be a very supportive environment for them. On the issue of staff, I think, as I mentioned before, there might be 350,000 people working in the aged care sector in Australia at the moment, but there's always a demand for additional staff. And as a nation, we have been reliant upon overseas migrants in particular to come and staff our aged care facilities because it's hard work, it's demanding work, and it can be difficult to find sufficient Australia-born people to do that work. I think part of the solution actually has to lie in training people and socialise, both in training staff to continue to improve the service they can offer, but also in terms of socialising residents into a better understanding of the cultural backgrounds of the people who are providing that care. I think it has to be part of a two-way dialogue, and that then calls for an approach to caregiving in those environments which is less transactional and more about community building in those environments.
We'll probably have time for one more question before, just at the front. Thanks, Fern.
Thank you. There was nothing in the study of 1,000 people, there were no migrants. You've referred a little bit to a two-way...
Excuse me, could you just speak up a little bit? I know people would like to hear your question.
You've referred to a two-way process, which I heartily applaud. However, people in homes, it's very difficult to get somebody from their own background. I've had to literally search for community members. They get paid and they're sent off to training while they're already working. Could you comment on the migrant situation and, you know, the plight of people who've never learnt English or lose it through dementia?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. Interestingly enough, the University of South Australia has a number of researchers work on exactly that topic. And I think one of the very interesting developments over recent years is increasingly migrant-focused aged care providers have gone through a period of renewal as generations who came out in the immediate post-war years and into the 60s and into the 70s are now increasingly looking to their own cultural backgrounds to provide support to them in older age. What I think that really means is that we need more programs that support those communities find the sorts of human resources you're talking about. And that could mean immigration from those source nations. You know, more immigration from Greece, more immigration from Italy, more immigration from the Ukraine. And in many ways, I think that would be a strong community building activity and something we should applaud.
I think we should finish at that point. We will be thanking our speakers at the end of the session today, but I just want to invite you now to have some afternoon tea. The staff will direct you as to where to go, but there are biscuits and tea and coffee. Look forward to seeing you back here in about 15 minutes. Thanks very much. Welcome back into the warmth of the lecture theatre. Can you still hear me at the back? Terrific, thanks very much indeed. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our second speaker this afternoon, Professor Wendy Lacey. Wendy is the Dean and Head of the Law School at the University of South Australia, and her teaching and research focuses primarily in the Australian public law and international human rights law arena. She's a frequent public speaker in these areas too, and to get some sense of the stature of her contribution and the depth of her professional research and public engagement, I'd just like to mention a few things, some of which you have on your program and some of which you don't. The first thing I'd like to say is that Wendy was on the Australian Law Commission's advisory committee to the federal government's national inquiry into elder abuse. And I was just talking to Wendy a few moments ago. That report, the report of that inquiry has come out just a couple of weeks ago, I think, and has some pretty significant recommendations, and I know that Wendy will speak a little bit more about that in her presentation. She's also played and is playing a pivotal role in the Australian Research Network on Law and Ageing, and is also a member of the steering committee of the Minister of Health in South Australia. That steering committee is tasked with monitoring the implementation of the state's strategy for safeguarding the rights of older persons. Who better to talk to us this afternoon? Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks, Fern, for your help. I think my presentation will probably follow on nicely from Andrew's. Andrew put it into a much broader context, and I'll be looking specifically at, well, more specifically, excuse me, let me just get my stick. Thanks, Fern. That there, so it doesn't. Looking specifically at some of the more recent developments around ageing and aged care, looking at it from an ethical standpoint, but also looking specifically at it from a human rights perspective. As Ruth indicated to you in her introduction, my areas of expertise are in Australian public law, specifically constitutional and administrative law, but also in how international human rights law intersects with Australian public law. So how do human rights have an impact on holding governments accountable? And how do we make sure that our laws are valid and that they take due consideration of Australia's international legal obligations, particularly our human rights obligations under a range of different conventions? But then I'm going to get a little bit more specific and have a look and take some consideration of the aged care, quality of care standards, looking specifically at the right to food and adequate nutrition. Now, I have a personal interest in this area, not just from a human rights perspective, but I'm also a director of the Maggie Beer Foundation Board, and obviously the foundation is heavily involved in trying to improve access to proper and nutritious food and beverages so that people can have comfort and joy in the food experience, not just learn to deal with the slops that can occasionally be served up in some of these facilities. Not to say that there aren't some outstanding facilities out there, and part of the foundation's strategy is also to highlight and champion those providers who do actually provide an outstanding service. I mean, some of them are obviously at the high end of the market and are very expensive, but the foundation is also heavily involved in running, they're also heavily subsidised and paid for, but allowing cooks and chefs to come and do training with Maggie Beer in her kitchen, whereby they can actually learn some of the tricks of the trade with the aim of enhancing the food experience in all aged care facilities. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But when I get to the legal aspects, looking particularly at international law, some of my slides are sort of quite legalistic. Obviously, the PowerPoint presentation will be made available on the website after today. So if I do skip through some of the more legalistic aspects, you'd have to forgive me, but it's mainly in the interests of time and to allow you the opportunity to ask me questions. So obviously that's who I am. I've been running the law school for just over 3 years, but I was part of the foundation staff that joined the law school in 2007 to establish the third law school here in South Australia. It's our 10th birthday year this year. But although most of my disciplinary expertise has been in the area of international and domestic public law, for the last 6.5 years I've been heavily involved in doing research projects and publishing in the area of ageing, the rights of older people, and particularly looking at how we might prevent elder abuse. So that's where those committee positions have come about through that work. And I'm totally committed to spending the rest of my research career in that space, because when I first entered this particular area, I found that I was the only lawyer often in the room, and there were very few lawyers who were actually doing any serious research on ageing and the rights of older people. So there was a serious gap. I can happily say that there are a number of us working through the research network now who are dedicated to looking at specific aspects of ageing and elder rights, and that stems from property law through to equity and trust, through to succession planning, wills and estates, as well as those of us looking at human rights and guardianship and administration and the like. So recent events, obviously this is a very topical issue, as Ruth said earlier. The Oakden affair has probably brought things to a real head, particularly in South Australia, but also nationally. And I think it's a travesty that we had to wait for something as shocking as the Oakden incident or incidents to really get the government to sit up and take notice. Back in 2011, I worked on a research project with the Office of the Public Advocate here in South Australia, and we looked into vulnerable adults and elder abuse in particular. And that report put forward a blueprint for the South Australian government to actually implement an adult protection legislation that would be comprehensive and would create a brand new unit that would have the responsibility and the legal authority to conduct investigations into alleged cases of elder abuse, and that would facilitate early intervention strategies whereby the police weren't the first port of call for seeking intervention. That report was tabled in Parliament by the then Minister John Hill, but then he shortly thereafter retired from Parliament, and so the government has actually had this report, but nothing has been done in any substantive sense to push that forward. And I suspect that following the public release of all the issues at Oakden and the fact that those issues have been a problem for over a decade will spur the government on to developing new strategies. And I'm happy to report that only just yesterday I had a conference call with some lawyers and policy experts from the Office for the Ageing, and the Minister for Ageing, Zoe Beddison, has actually called for a policy platform to be developed that she will then take to Cabinet. So I'm very hopeful that the state government is now demonstrating that they have the political will to move forward in this area, and so I'm hopeful that you'll see and hear a lot more about this issue in the lead up to the next state election. Yeah, that is worth an applause. Yeah. But it's not just Oakden, it's not just the scandals that are bringing this issue to a head. Elder abuse has become a significant issue for all governments around Australia, both local, state and federal. And many local councils here in South Australia have developed or have started to develop age-friendly city strategies. I think the cities of Unley and Salisbury are the most advanced in that regard. So if you're fortunate enough to live in those council areas, then you already have quite a detailed age-friendly city strategy that's combined with a number of recommendations that council is pursuing. But we're actually doing an evaluation at the moment into all 16 councils in South Australia that are working in this space, and we'll be reporting back to the Office for the Ageing later this year on that. So there's a lot taking place right around the country. I think the most important things that have happened in the last 12 months have been the 3 inquiries into elder abuse. We had New South Wales was the first jurisdiction to take the lead, and I drafted their terms of reference for their, they had a general standing committee be given the reference from Parliament to investigate elder abuse in New South Wales and to identify strategies for improving the responses to and the prevention of elder abuse. What's really fantastic about the New South Wales report is that it's completely rights-based, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I think it's so important that the human rights, the dignity, the autonomy, the things that Andrew spoke of in his presentation are absolutely essential to inform these policies and these legislative frameworks. Because if you don't, the tendency is to treat older people as though they cannot make decisions for themselves. And that's just paternalistic and wrong as far as I'm concerned. So I'm a big proponent of human rights. I don't think they're adequately protected in Australia, and I don't think they're adequately protected under international law just yet either. You might be surprised to know that older people are the only category or cohort of human beings that don't have their own international human rights convention. And that, I think, is appalling. Although we don't have a treaty as yet that would be binding on nation states that signed up to it, we do have a lot of what's called soft law and guidelines at the international level. And we do have a process that's being pursued under the auspices of the United Nations. It's the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Ageing, and that's where a number of sort of civil society organisations and many countries, particularly Latin American countries, are pushing for an international convention on the rights of older people. And I support that move, but interestingly, you might be surprised to know that it's the developed Western nations that are actually resisting that development. So, and that includes Australia, who claims that it's sitting on the fence. But in reality, if countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the EU and the like, if they don't get behind these types of initiatives, then they don't end up resulting in a new convention. So if you wanted to lobby your local member of parliament, I would get onto your federal representative and ask questions about what the government's position is on a new convention for the rights of older people. But they remain, particularly those over the age of 85 and those suffering from dementia, they remain some of our most vulnerable citizens, and I just don't think we're doing enough to set the normative framework in place that will provide protections, but also in a way that's respectful of the rights, dignity and autonomy of older people. So I'm going to continue pushing on that front, but I'd encourage all of you who have an interest in that to follow what's going on at the United Nations. So we also had, thank you, the South Australian Parliament, through the work of Kelly Vincent, obviously she's from the Party of Dignity for Disability, put a motion in Parliament to have a South Australian inquiry into elder abuse, and that was endorsed by both sides of Parliament. It then became a joint committee, and they've been receiving submissions over the last few months. The terms of reference were then expanded in recent weeks to include the capacity for the committee to look into the Oakden affair. So they'll be taking a little bit longer to release their report, but I think that that's a positive step, that the Joint Committee has actually got that term of reference added to its terms. I gave evidence a few weeks ago before the committee, and they had read the report that I referred to that we wrote with the Public Advocate in 2011, all of the members of the committee had read that report and spoke very positively about it. So there seems to be a lot of political momentum from all parties, particularly the two major parties, and there was really strong representation at the committee hearings themselves. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some really positive steps in the right direction over the next 6 to 12 months here in South Australia. But perhaps the most important thing to develop at the national level was the reference to the Australian Law Reform Commission by the Federal Attorney-General, Senator Brandis, to give the Commission the power to conduct a national inquiry into elder abuse. And that I think is really important, because there's a lot of overlapping powers between the state governments and the federal government with respect to ageing. You might be surprised to know that actually the Commonwealth has very limited constitutional power to legislate with respect to older people. They can't introduce adult protection legislation because they simply don't have the power. They can regulate corporations and they can provide aged care benefits. So that's how they regulate aged care. They require every aged care facility to be incorporated so they can use their corporation's power. And they also control the pension, which means that they can control how welfare is actually distributed to older people. So it's primarily through those two powers, which are contained in Section 51 of the Constitution, that the federal government seems to have this sort of overarching control of aged care, when in reality it's the states and the state governments who have the larger powers with regard to older people. So if, for example, Andrew gave you some statistics about reportable assaults in aged care facilities, those reports are made to state police departments. If there's an issue of mental incapacity, it's the state public guardians and advocates who are brought in. It's the state agencies who actually deal with those assaults and prosecute them. It's not the federal department and it's not the federal police. So the importance of actually tackling some of the challenges of federalism that Andrew referred to is absolutely essential. And as complex as COAG might be, it's going to be a fundamental area for development over the next few years. The other thing that you should be aware of is South Australia has a strategy for safeguarding the rights of older South Australians. I was involved in developing that strategy, and I wrote a Charter of Rights and Freedoms for older South Australians that is the bedrock of that strategy. And as Ruth pointed out, I'm still on the steering committee that is still monitoring the implementation of that strategy. It is just a policy instrument, so it's not legally binding, but it is a mandatory relevant consideration for every department and agency that works in aged care. So it's a step in the right direction, but I was very heartened to hear that the government is now considering legislation, which I think is absolutely essential. Okay, so the ethics of aged care. Well, for me, I come at it as a human rights lawyer, so I tend to see human rights and the normative framework that human rights provides as being one mechanism for ensuring that we have an ethical framework for providing aged care services in Australia. So, as I said, the Closing the Gaps report, which we produced in 2011, adopted that type of approach and recommended to government that they adopt a comprehensive Adult Protection Act. And one of the benefits of having an Adult Protection Act would be not only would it safeguard the rights of older South Australians, it would also safeguard the rights of any disabled adult. So it would provide safeguarding mechanisms for any person who was vulnerable over the age of 18. We obviously have the Children's Protection Act, which applies to people from 0 to 17. But I'm hopeful, very hopeful, that we'll see some progress being made in the next 6 to 12 months on that. You'll see that the ALRC report, if you can find it, it's report number 131, and it's available on the ALRC website. The report is actually titled Protecting the Rights of Older Australians from Abuse. So you can see that the language of human rights, the notions of dignity, autonomy and self-determination are informing all of the developments that we're seeing at the state and the national level. The New South Wales Parliamentary Report, I've already mentioned that it had a rights-based premise underlying it, but it also specifically refers to human rights in Recommendation 1 and says that all the recommendations have to be premised on a number of key elements, one of which is a rights-based framework that empowers older people. So it's not about adopting paternalistic policies, it's about empowering older people to be able to exercise their right to live a dignified older age and to empower them to exercise their rights for as long as possible. The South Australian Joint Parliamentary Inquiry, as I said, is still ongoing, but that is likely to report before the end of the year. But from everything that I saw and heard when I gave evidence a few weeks ago, they are clearly adopting a rights-based approach that has been informed by closing the gaps. So I'm hopeful that that one will adopt a similar approach that hopefully will provide a basis upon which we might see a more ethical approach to aged care. So, human rights and the ethics of aged care. This is my personal view. I believe that it should be based on recognising, protecting and respecting the rights and the dignity of all older persons. But the Aged Care Act doesn't really go that far. The Aged Care Act is 20 years old this year, and in my view it needs a complete overhaul, and it probably needs to be repealed and replaced with a brand new piece of legislation. The user rights principles, which are a form of delegated legislation attached to the Act, include charters of rights for both residents of aged care facilities as well as recipients of home and community care packages, but none of them are binding. So if your rights are breached, there's no remedy, there's no redress that you can actually seek, even though you can make a formal complaint. The complaint system is so inadequate that basically all they get is a slap over the wrist and be given a notification that they have to lift their game. Now, that is not rights focused. That is not aimed at providing some sort of redress which is geared towards supporting the older person who is receiving care. And in my mind, that is not rights-based. And for that reason, I think that basically the charters of rights contained in these regulations merely pay lip service to human rights. They're not actually focused on enhancing the lived experience of recipients of care. So, sorry, my hay fever's a bit bad today, so I've got pseudoephedrine, so I'm a little bit dry. Turning to look at international law and the right to food, which is really just one human right that, and there's a whole raft of human rights from looking at people with disabilities to looking at economic, social and cultural rights to civil and political rights. So things ranging from the right to vote to the right to have your family respected and your privacy respected. These are all, really comprehensive ranges of rights that are protected under international law. But as I said earlier, there is no current convention at the international level, although the Open-Ended Working Group is definitely trying to move in that direction. Only 2 international human rights treaties even refer to older people. So that is the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that's it, with the exception of the other treaties which actually prevent or prohibit discrimination on the basis of age, which can then be used to prevent discrimination against older people. Basically, there's nothing currently in international law which protects the rights or refers specifically to older people as a vulnerable group or a potentially vulnerable group. But Australia is party to all of the other human rights treaties, which include what we refer to as the International Bill of Rights. And that includes the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which, although it's only declaratory, is considered to be customary international law. That means that over the course of time, it has become accepted as binding on states because of its powerful content. The International Bill of Rights also includes 2 1966 conventions, what's called the ICCPR, or the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and ICESCA, or the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And I'll show you in a minute. So here's Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that refers to your having an adequate standing of living, which extends to food. So the right to food is always, from the very earliest days of the United Nations, has been included in these key international instruments which bind Australia. But if we turn to Article 11 of ICESCA, then you've got a little bit more detail creeping in to the actual right itself. And you can see that it's about having adequate food that has a number of different areas of focus, that people should be free from hunger, that we need to improve methods of production, conservation and the distribution of food, and also disseminate knowledge of the principles of nutrition. So you're starting to see over time more specificity entering into the lexicon of international human rights law. But there are a number of other ways that international law develops, and this is what we refer to as sort of the non-binding instruments, or what we call soft law. But this is often what happens before we end up seeing binding international treaties be developed. And they're really important because a lot of statements that are made by committees or by other arms of the United Nations actually develop basically guiding principles for nation states which help them to understand how they might actually implement their binding treaty obligations. So the binding treaty obligation is contained in the UDHR, as well as the Covenant on Civil, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But the statements from bodies like the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights can then elaborate upon what it actually means to give effect to those obligations under international law. And here the committee, in its General Comment 12, that the right to adequate food is realised when every man, woman and child, alone and in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement. So again, you gradually see over time more specificity coming in. Then in 2008, we had the UN appoint a special rapporteur on the right to food, who then extended that definition. So now you're seeing things like regular, permanent and unrestricted access, either directly or by means of financial purchases, and they refer to both the quantity and the quality of food. This is something that Maggie Beer herself is really passionate about, that it's not just about having adequate food for nutrition, it's also about the importance socially and culturally of sharing food with others. And in her mind, it's about the joy and the comfort that is brought by sharing food with other people, by having community gardens in aged care facilities, in having people involved in working out the menu, in having older people engaged in preparing food and helping to participate in cooking food. But of course, you know, the risk-averse nature of many facilities means that you can't even have chickens and produce your own eggs in aged care facilities because of the potential risk of getting food poisoning from a dodgy egg. So the regulations are so restrictive in what you can actually do in facilities, but Maggie's trying to advance that through advocacy work by having things like, I'm quickly running out of time, but having things like, so whatever's on the menu for the night's meal, because as people age, depending on their medical condition, their appetites can wane. And so it can be really hard to get people to actually intake sufficient nutrition to keep them healthy. But they've discovered that even if you just bake scones in the middle of the afternoon for afternoon tea, that itself, just the smell, the fragrance of scones baking in the oven can actually whet the appetite of older people. So the foundation itself, under the leadership of Maggie, is actually engaging and sponsoring a lot of research that's looking at the science behind nutrition. You know, we see random things like the fact that in many aged care facilities they put you on a low-fat diet when that's the last thing you need. Often you're losing weight at a crazy rate, and you need to have more healthy fats in your diet, that they use supplements when they should be using fresh seasonal produce. And so, you know, these are the sorts of things that the Foundation is trying to advocate for. So basically, we've now got to a point in international law where availability, adequacy and accessibility of food has become much more clearly articulated in international instruments. But I think one of the really important things that's come out of these developments is the recognition of the non-nutrient values of food, recognising the importance of the fact that families gather over food, communities gather over food, extended families gather over food. You know, Christmas, Easter, whatever holiday we tend to share with our family and friends, generally we come together over food, and that it's really important for social inclusion, for engagement, and for staying healthy for as long as possible, that you need to recognise it's not just about the science of nutrition. It's not just about that you're getting all the vitamins and minerals that you need. It's about recognising the fact that you should be able to dine when you want, not just at the time that's most convenient for the orderlies to get you to the dining room. And we've heard of ghastly stories where people who live in the same corridor in an aged care facility have to eat at the same time at the same table as those who share their corridor, because that's what's easiest for the aged care facility. You know, when in fact you should be free to sit wherever you want in the dining room, and you should be given a window of time when you can eat at a time that suits you, not at a time that necessarily suits the facility. So other guidelines from international law come from the Food and Agricultural Organisation from the United Nations. I won't go through these, but you can see that these are based on principles like protect, respect and fulfil, that they're much more comprehensive than just what the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights provides. I don't need to go through those. These are just additional areas of soft law that are helping to get much more concrete standards built into the normative framework. So in Australia, what's the current position? Well, you would know, many of you would be well aware of the fact that we don't have a Charter of Rights in any jurisdiction in Australia. A Charter of Rights implies that it would be a Bill of Rights, that it would be constitutionally enforceable, and we don't have anything like that. In fact, Australia's resisted, governments time and time again have resisted that. Only the ACT and Victoria currently have a statutory Charter of Rights. Now, because it's a statute and it's not attached to a constitution, it means that you cannot invalidate legislation on the basis of the fact that it breaches the human rights contained in a charter. You should also be aware that these charters of rights, or the statutory charters of rights, mainly cover civil and political rights. They don't cover economic, social and cultural rights like the right to food. So they're not comprehensive in any way, shape or form. They can influence the interpretation of other acts, and they can certainly influence decision making at the government level, but they are not enforceable in the way that they are in the UK, Canada and New Zealand. We have anti-discrimination legislation, which prevents discrimination on the basis of age. But as a recent report from the Australian Human Rights Commission that was done a few years ago indicated, Australia is an inherently ageist society. And if you don't tackle ageism, you are not going to tackle discrimination. And we know for a fact that the large majority of cases that are brought to the Commission relate to workplace discrimination against older people. And you don't need to be 65 to be discriminated against. You can be 45 and be discriminated against on the basis of your age. So anyone over the age of 45 is much more likely to be a victim of discrimination in the workplace. We also have parliamentary committees in every jurisdiction that reviews legislation for compliance with Australia's international legal obligations. And that can actually ensure that the legislation that we adopt is actually consistent with our human rights obligations. And I think the most important one is the Human Rights Parliamentary Scrutiny Committee in the Federal Parliament, which does a lot of work around this, but was only introduced in 2011. And then we also have common law rights. But our common law rights can be overruled by statute, and they don't extend to the right to food. So, aged care accreditation standards. We only have 44 standards that need to be complied with to be accredited as an aged care facility. And I'm talking about residential aged care here, not retirement villages or the like. They're in 4 categories, and the right to food is protected under health and personal care. This is largely a tick-in-the-box exercise. Provided that you have policies and protocols in place and that you're doing your best in a certain area, you're likely to be accredited. And as I said, the complaint scheme is woefully inadequate for ensuring that there is substantive compliance with even just the intention behind these standards. So, Division 2.1 of the Aged Care Act governs the process by which you can seek accreditation under the Aged Care Act. So, for the purposes of receiving Commonwealth funding for places in aged care facilities, you have to comply with these standards. So, one of the criterions for approval in these applications is that the aged care provider is able to meet relevant standards for the provision of aged care, and then they relate to the quality of care and to the principles of care enunciated in the quality of care principles. As you might have guessed, the Aged Care Act and its associated regulations is hugely complex, and most of the important stuff is not actually contained in the Act. It's contained in regulations attached to the Act, and sometimes in schedules attached to the regulations attached to the Act. So, I mean, if a lawyer like me struggles to read the damn thing and understand it, imagine how the ordinary punter finds dealing with this whole regime. It's pretty appalling. So the quality of care principles with regard to the right to food talks about meals of adequate variety, quality and quantity for each care recipient, served each day at times generally acceptable to both care recipients and management, and generally consisting of 3 meals per day, plus morning tea, afternoon tea and supper. I don't know how supper came in. I don't know. Special dietary requirements have to be taken into account with consideration to medical need or religious or cultural observance. So that, to some extent, adds a little more flesh to the bones. It means that you have to take into account the particular cultural and religious background of certain people in residence, which is important. But again, as I said, the practices are still woefully inadequate in terms of recognising subsection B. And here you are, you get food including fruit of adequate variety, quality and quantity, and non-alcoholic beverages including fruit juice. Now, when I gave a presentation on these standards to the Maggie Beer Foundation Board, Maggie was horrified, as you might imagine, because she wants to grow old, eating whatever she wants, drinking wine, having her ice cream and her chocolate, and basically having a good food life. And the motto of the foundation is creating an appetite for life, which recognises both the nutritional aspects and the non-nutritional aspects of food and how important food is to the lived experience of older people. So, as I said, it's largely a tick-in-the-box exercise. Facilities get away with blue murder, basically, in terms of the quality of food in many facilities. I agree with Andrew that many do a good job, but when it comes to food, I think that's one area where the standards are simply inadequate to convey to facilities what people should be having access to. And I just think we need a better set of regulations. So what would an ethical approach to the right to food look like? So I actually think it's the provision of adequate food and nutrition, but not in an inherently vague set of standards. It needs to be much more specific. It needs to look at the social and cultural aspects of food and of sharing of food, of being involved in the preparation of food, the planning of menus, of having a garden where people can actually get out in the fresh air and be involved in food growth and food preparation. I think that while international law and a number of other instruments provide a clear set of additional guidelines, they have not been used to fully inform the setting of standards for the Australian aged care system, and I think that's a problem. I think that residents of aged care facilities who are among some of our most vulnerable citizens should be guaranteed access to adequate food and beverages that are varied, locally sourced, seasonal and fresh wherever possible, and nutritionally sound. But furthermore, food needs also to be respective of culture, catered to a person's health and medical needs, and should promote social inclusion. To quote Maggie Beer, food should bring joy and comfort, not just nutrition. And what we need is both better and clearer regulations, but also cultural change among CEOs of these facilities. And one of the projects that the Foundation's heavily involved in, and we're running one in the next month, is we do training, whole day training sessions for the CEOs of aged care facilities, and they actually get to do a mystery box and actually cook with Maggie Beer. And Maggie just basically teaches them the importance of food and of sharing and enjoying food in community with others, and how important that is to the health and well-being of older people living in residential facilities. We also need to train cooks and chefs, but there's only one Maggie Beer, and she's not getting any younger, and so this needs to be a movement that goes beyond Maggie and the Foundation. We need more investment, we need more research which actually supports the training of staff in these facilities so that they become passionate, just like Maggie is, about the importance of food in aged care. And I thought I'd end by quoting from the mission of the Maggie Beer Foundation. I obviously, have a vested interest in promoting the Foundation, but I thought it was important to leave you with this. These are Maggie's own words that she devised herself. So the Foundation itself has been operating since 2014. It's Maggie's legacy, it's what she wants to leave behind. And she wants the Foundation to outlive her and to ensure that food and the sharing of food in residential aged care becomes something that residential facilities actually use as a point of distinction and as a hallmark of quality. And I think that that's where we're headed. I do think that aged care with an ageing population is going to become much more competitive, and that facilities will be competing against one another for residents. And one of the ways in which they can distinguish themselves in a very competitive marketplace is to provide excellent facilities and services. And one of those should be food and nutrition. So Maggie's really passionate about this. Although she's despondent about some of the practices, she's ultimately optimistic, as you might imagine Maggie would be. And she just sees it as a huge opportunity. And if none of you have been to the Foundation website, I'd encourage you to go and have a look. Maggie shares all of her recipes. There's lots of tips for facilities and providers. So if you do have some concerns, if you have relatives living in residential aged care facilities, I'd encourage you to speak to the management of those facilities and encourage them to get involved in some of the work of the Foundation. Send their CEOs to the training days, send their cooks and chefs to the cooking days that Maggie does, and encourage them to take a much more comprehensive approach to looking at the right to food. So just to summarise, I think for me, human rights provides one very important basis for promoting an ethical framework for aged care, and the right to food is merely one, but it's a really important one, and I hope that the work of the Foundation will assist in promoting that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Wendy. That's been really a quite unique introduction to us to the challenges in the aged care centre and the opportunities but in the aged care sector through the whole concept of right to food. We have time for questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That was very interesting. I think we've got to look at a few issues with food. First of all, aged care is institutional living, and I think we've got to come to this realization. It's not living in your own home or somebody else's home. It's an institution. It's run as an institution. So some of the problems that you highlighted are just there as a result of being an institution. Most meals in aged care facilities run at, for the food costs, probably between $2 and $5 per day. So we're not talking extravagance at all. You mentioned CEOs. I can honestly say, hand on heart, that most CEOs don't ever go in the kitchen. They wouldn't know what's actually happening. But I think the biggest problem we've got to look at is not what happens in the kitchen, it's what happens post-kitchen. Okay, the meals go out to units or they go out to tables, and this is why we're seeing a lot of malnutrition right now, is because the meals are put in front of people. They're left there for a few minutes, the person doesn't look at them, or they disengage with the meal, so therefore it's taken back, and people are actually suffering malnutrition right now. So I think before we look at the kitchen aspect of it, we really have to look at that service delivery aspect to make sure that it happens. And if we don't do that, then people are still going to be malnourished.
I think that's a really good comment that you've made. We have seen some research that estimates that up to 85% of people in certain aged care facilities are malnourished. Now that is just appalling in a modern Western democracy.
Can you hear that at the back?
Can you hear that? Did you all hear the question? Yeah, so I just think that that's outrageous. So we need to do a lot more research in this space, and I think, and it can't just be about nutrition, it has to be about the non-nutritional value of food as well. It's an excellent point you make. I actually thought that the average in Australia was about $9 per day per resident spent on food and beverages. Yeah, and I thought that was appalling, but if it's 2 to 5, that's just disgraceful.
I mean, it is better right now. We're looking at juice, but for a long time it was cordial rather than juice. So it's one of the situations that...
But I suspect it's watered down juice, and it probably wouldn't be fresh or seasonal either. Yeah.
There's one right next to you, thanks.
And there's one.
Thank you. May I make a couple of comments first?
Of course.
A plea for consideration from a semiotic perspective of the word protection. There's a certain consistency between protection of children and protection of vulnerable adults that doesn't do them any favours. I do commend all the discussion on food. I can't stress its importance enough. The area I'd like an update from you, if you're able to comment on, is the extremely fraught area of sexuality. As a community mental health worker, the problems that I had to deal with raise varied from the rights of a resident to Viagra to continue a relationship with his wife, families' perspective on their aged parent, even making friends with a person of the opposite sex, religious institutions not allowing different sexes into each other's bedrooms, and I regret to say our own staff putting their homophobic attitudes onto relationships of homosexual couples.
Yeah.
So if you're able to comment on those, and I would love to hear that it's going better.
Yeah. I think you've raised some excellent points. I'll start with the last one first. I totally agree with you 100% that we are completely ill-equipped to deal with sexuality in aged care, let alone dealing with same-sex couples or other forms of transgender. It should be a fundamental right, no matter how old you are, to be in a sexual relationship. But if we can't get same-sex marriage sorted out at the national level, I don't like our chances of actually improving things in aged care facilities. But I do think it's an absolutely critical issue.
Can I just say that in the States and Canada, they are beginning to tackle that issue with facilities that specially cater for people with those issues.
I should also add that Canada and the US, the UK, Scotland are decades ahead of Australia when it comes to elder abuse and elder rights. Mind you, they do have a longer history of human rights charters, which gives a completely different framework within which these issues are addressed. But Australia's lagging behind the rest of the development world. The second point you made, what was the second point you made?
I was supportive of everything that you had said on the food.
Food, yeah.
So important.
Absolutely.
The other issue was the use of the word protection.
Protection. Yeah, no. I understand the concern about protection. Totally. I obviously get that. And I'm a huge believer that we need to do everything we can to prevent paternalistic decision-making and paternalistic policies from being developed. The whole idea of empowering older people to exercise their rights as well as they can for as long as they can is what it's all about. So it's the empowerment model, and that's where the human rights are so important. The word protection doesn't really need to be used. It could be a safeguarding. You could use Adult Safeguarding Act. I think protection is used in Scotland, for example. They have an Adult Protection Act, but they don't use the word abuse and they don't use the word vulnerable. They refer to older people who are at risk of harm and who are, at risk of harm. That's the way they frame it. So they're not using that language, which a lot of older people don't like the idea of it being described as elder abuse, because in 80% of cases, the perpetrators are the children. And they don't want their children prosecuted and sent to jail. They just want the abuse to stop. So I think using that language, and I've also recommended to Office for the Ageing yesterday that if they're going to develop a strategy for implementing legislation in South Australia, they need to adopt the nothing about us without us approach, which means they need to do a broad-based community consultation that actually enables the voices of older people to be heard.
I really appreciate you having picked that to pieces along the lines that I think. And I do feel that aged care suffered hugely when the language aged care industry was first adopted.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree.
One right at the back there, Fern, just on your left. Oh, right at the back and then a closer one. Thanks.
We urgently need voluntary euthanasia law. It's a human right. It ensures the sense of dignity and self-control of elders, and it will help the care sector. You didn't even mention the issue.
Well, I couldn't cover every human right. There's just too many of them. So I thought I'd focus on something I knew more about, which was the right to food. When it comes to euthanasia, there is actually no human right under international law that gives you a right to voluntary euthanasia. So it's not actually protected, although I'm almost certain that there would be General Assembly resolutions which deal with the end of life and the right to palliative care. And I know that the palliative care associations, both international and national around the world, have done a lot of work around end of life and making sure that people can have a dignified end of life. Personally, I'm a fan of euthanasia. I think voluntary euthanasia should be adopted, but everyone has their own particular personal religious preferences, and I appreciate that it's not for everyone. I also believe that we need to be very, very cautious about the potential for abuse of any voluntary euthanasia law. And I actually made a suggestion to a colleague who works in medical health and ethics. I said, well, maybe we should apply it to people under the age of 50 for a 5-year window period and see if it gets abused then, because you can trial it with people who are suffering from terminal illnesses but who aren't suffering from dementia or aren't being overpowered by a child who has a power of attorney. So it's a very complex area, rife with a whole range of both legal and moral issues, and I don't think I have the answer to that one.
Thanks, Fern.
You've been talking about an older person. Now tell me, what's the definition of an older person? Because I see in the paper sometimes they talk about an elderly person who's about 57 or something like that.
Well,
I don't feel like an older person.
Yeah. So I agree, and it's so under social security law, which is what the federal government usually refers to, and state governments, you're an older person if you're age 65 and over and eligible for the pension. If you're Indigenous, it's generally 40 or 45 because they have such a shorter life expectancy. In some circumstances, if you're over the age of 40, you're considered to be sort of a senior. So I'm 44 and I'm considered to be a senior staff member, as they categorise us by age, within the University of South Australia. That's how the HR department actually classifies us. So, I just don't think there's any. I think the generic definition used around the world is either 60 or 65, but with people living to 100 plus, when is that going to shift? And the statistics that were brought out by the Council for the Ageing back in 2011, only 1% of Australians over the age of 65 live in residential care, and for people over the age of 80, that increases to 15%. So if you think about that, the large majority of Australians who are over the age of 65 don't receive any form of federal funding or aged care support. And that's about 87.5% of all older Australians don't receive any form of subsidy from the Commonwealth Government. So they don't even have the minor benefits of the Aged Care Act and the quality of care standards that they have, as weak as they might be at the moment. So again, I agree with you. I think it's a moving feast and it's a bit arbitrary to pick a number out, but governments have to for the purposes of the pension. That's a question, Dan.
Question.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said about food. And I know we're talking long-term aged care, but one part of our healthcare system that is 70%, as I understand it, people over 65 to 70, is the hospital.
Yeah.
Can you also extend some of this information about suitable food, good food, and, as was alluded to before, actually feeding people who need help with eating to the hospital system? Maybe extend your wings just a bit?
You mean the wings of the foundation or my research?
The wings of the foundation. I think,
Well, I'm seeing Maggie tonight. I can certainly raise it with her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
You're dealing with a different government, so state governments run the hospitals, so you'd have to lobby your state parliamentarians on that.
So it's okay that people don't get fed when they go to hospital for 2 or 3 days. If their tray's put in front of them and they haven't eaten, they said, oh, they didn't want it. If the person can't verbalize, it is quite atrocious. And yes, I know they're not starving to death in 2 or 3 days. But in terms of human rights, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Well, our last question, Fern, just next to you there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Wendy, had you finished?
No, I'll take that up with Maggie tonight.
Okay.
I'd just like to ask,
I noticed driving here today, heard on the news that the Oakden investigation was voted again to be kept in secret. Have you any comment on that?
No, I haven't caught up with that bit of news. But I know this Joint Parliamentary Committee has definitely got an additional term of reference to investigate, and that will be made public. I presume they will suppress names, and they will certainly make it so that any informant will not be publicly released. So they'll have to do that to protect the privacy and the security of those people who are informing the inquiry. But the report itself will have to be made public. It would be exceedingly rare for a parliamentary committee to suppress any form of a final report.
Thank you. I just would like to thank you as the audience for your probing questions. I'm sure that both Andrew and Wendy have been delighted and challenged to receive your questions and answer them. Before I thank our two excellent speakers on your behalf, I just would like to mention the next Successful Ageing seminar, which is in September. It's on the very relevant topic of pain. And I'd like to just invite Andrew to come forward and Wendy, and we want to give you each a token of our appreciation for a very informative, very timely presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks, Wendy.